On the morning country music singer Keith Whitley died, he had plans for lunch, a round of golf, and an afternoon spent writing songs. It was Tuesday, the 9th of May, 1989. Keith woke early and called his mother. Not a long call, just checking in, the way he did. His wife, Lori Morgan, was on a promotional trip to Alaska, preparing for the release of her own debut album, and the house was quiet. His brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, arrived sometime that morning, and the two of them sat down for coffee. They talked about golf. They talked about where to have lunch. Keith mentioned what he planned to do that afternoon, write songs. Some for himself, some for Lori to record when she got back from tour. There was a card he'd pressed into her hand at the Nashville airport the last time they saw each other. He'd written that if he had any wish, it was that her life would be full of sunlight and that he'd always get to see the smile in her eyes. Lane left the house at approximately 8:30 in the morning, telling Keith to be ready to go within the hour. 1 month earlier, Keith Whitley's third consecutive #1 single had left the top of the Billboard country chart. His label was already in discussions about what came next. He'd recently been invited to become a full member of the Grand Ole Opry, something he'd dreamed about since he was a child in Sandy Hook, Kentucky. At 33 years old, he'd finally become the artist everyone around him had spent a decade saying he was going to be. When Lane Palmer came back to the house, he found Keith unconscious in his bedroom. The medical examiner later put his blood alcohol concentration at 0.47, roughly 20 shots of 100 proof whiskey, almost 5 times the legal driving limit in Tennessee, on an ordinary Tuesday morning with golf clubs waiting and songs left to write. What happened in the 12 months before that morning is the story of a man who got everything he ever chased and couldn't survive it. Keith Whitley was born in Sandy Hook, Kentucky in the mid-1950s, in a part of the country where music wasn't background noise. It was how people marked time, how they made sense of loss, how they told each other things they couldn't say plainly. He grew up inside that tradition the way some kids grow up inside religion, completely, and from the very beginning. By the time he was 15, he was performing publicly, and not in school plays or talent shows. He was on stage with Ralph Stanley, one of the genuine founding figures of bluegrass music. Stanley had heard something in the boy's voice that was hard to put a name to but impossible to miss. A quality that felt older than the person it was coming out of, something worn in, like a piece of wood that had been handled a long time. Those who studied it closely heard traces of Carter Stanley, Ralph's late brother, and one of the defining voices of traditional bluegrass, and the influence of Lefty Frizzell, the honky-tonk singer from the 50s whose phrasing had shaped more country voices than most people realized. In Keith Whitley, those lineages converged into something that sounded like inheritance rather than imitation. He spent years in the world of traditional country and bluegrass, playing alongside men who'd built careers on pure musicianship and the willingness to work roots music when the rest of Nashville was chasing pop crossover. He worked with J.D. Crowe and the New South. He shared stages with Ricky Skaggs, another young musician from that same tradition who would eventually pull him toward Nashville. Whitley arrived in Nashville in 1983. He was in his late 20s by then, which in the music business is not young. He'd already spent the kind of time developing his craft that most artists spend their entire careers on. He could sing, genuinely, uncomfortably well, in a way that made people stop what they were doing. RCA Records signed him. His first album, LA to Miami, came out in 1985. The single Miami, Miami charted, and he wasn't yet a star, but he was on his way, and Nashville was starting to pay attention. What it couldn't see yet, what almost no one outside his immediate circle fully grasped, was that the same sensitivity that made Keith Whitley extraordinary on stage was making ordinary life very difficult to get through. After the modest success of LA to Miami, RCA sent Keith back into the studio. He worked with producer Blake Mevis, experienced and professional, and they made a record. Keith listened back to what they'd built together, and he hated it. Not in the way artists sometimes complain about the mix, or wish they'd taken a second pass at a vocal. He believed genuinely and deeply that the album didn't represent who he was as a singer or what he was capable of. So he went back to his label and asked them to shelve it. That's not something a rising artist with limited leverage typically does. RCA had spent money on those sessions. There was a schedule to consider, a release window, the ordinary arithmetic of a record company's calendar. Keith Whitley was not yet a star. He was a mid-tier RCA act with one album behind him and a reasonable but not exceptional chart history, and yet they agreed. He went back into the studio with a new producer, Garth Fundis, and they started again from scratch. The result was the album that would become Don't Close Your Eyes, released on the 31st of May, 1988. The title track was written by Bob McDill, a quiet and restrained piece about a man who suspects his partner is thinking about someone else. On the page it sounds modest. In Keith Whitley's voice it became something else entirely. The first two singles from the album had done respectably, the kind of chart performance that keeps an artist relevant and a label patient. But the title track was different. Released as the album's third single in March of 1988, by summer it was sitting at number 1 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. By the end of the year, Billboard named it the number 1 country single of the entire year. For the first time in his career, Keith Whitley was exactly where he'd always been heading. If you're finding this story worth your time, subscribing keeps more of them coming, and there's a lot more country music history where this came from. The summer of 1988 was the best of Keith Whitley's life. Don't Close Your Eyes reached number 1 on the 13th of August, his first ever chart topper. After years of climbing slowly and watching other acts shoot past him, he performed it at the Grand Ole Opry, an early performance that people who were there still talk about, not for any theatrical reason, but simply because of what came out of him when he sang it at live. The song wasn't a showstopper by design. In his hands, it became one anyway. The follow-up single, When You Say Nothing at All, went to number 1 as well, back-to-back chart toppers, same year, same album. Nashville was no longer merely paying attention. Nashville was rearranging itself around him. He'd married Lori Morgan in 1986 during the tour for his first album. She was already a well-established figure in country music, an Opry member since her early 20s, one of the institution's youngest ever invited. Their son Jesse had been born in 1987. And publicly, by Keith's own account, the marriage had changed him. He told interviewers plainly that Lori had saved his life. He'd struggled with alcohol since his teenage years, and he said without hesitation that because of her, he'd straightened himself out. Country music embraced that story. Here was the gifted singer who'd waited 15 years for his moment, had demanded artistic integrity when he had no leverage to demand it, had found love, and was now delivering some of the most emotionally precise records Nashville had heard in years. He and Lori were called Mr. and Mrs. Country Music, and their life from the outside looked like the version of the story where everything works out. In January of 1989, his 5th single was released, I'm No Stranger to the Rain, a song about a man who's been knocked down enough times that hard weather no longer frightens him, went to number 1. 3 consecutive number 1 singles. In the same era that would produce George Strait as its reigning traditionalist and launch the careers of Randy Travis and Garth Brooks, Keith Whitley was holding his own at the very top of the neo-traditional country movement, the wave of artists pushing back against pop crossover and insisting the music remember what it came from. And then, shortly before the spring of 1989, the Grand Ole Opry offered him full membership. The Opry doesn't give that lightly, and it doesn't give it quickly. That invitation meant the institution which had defined country music for half a century had looked at what Keith Whitley built and decided it belonged there permanently. He accepted. He was 33 years old, 3 consecutive number 1s deep, and the most important stage in country music had just told him he was going to be there for the rest of his career. The public story of Keith Whitley in 1988 was a redemption arc. The private story was more complicated. His relationship with alcohol hadn't started in adulthood, and it hadn't started quietly. People who knew him from the bluegrass years, from the bands he'd moved through before Nashville, from the circuit he'd worked for over a decade, understood that drinking wasn't incidental to his life. It was woven through it. It had been there since he was very young, in a part of Kentucky where that wasn't particularly unusual, and it had stayed. When he arrived in Nashville and began his climb, the people around him carried that knowledge with them. Nashville is a small town dressed up as an industry, and the things that matter travel fast and stay remembered. Keith Whitley's gift was spoken about widely and genuinely. So was the other thing. J.D. Crowe, who'd led the band Keith played in before his move to Nashville, spoke about it after Keith died. He said he'd talked to Keith about it, that he'd been worried. His words in the days after the death carried the particular weight of someone who'd feared exactly this outcome and hadn't been wrong. Lori knew. She hadn't married a man whose struggles were hidden from her. She'd come alongside him through them, and she believed, with real reason to believe, that the worst was behind them. Keith had said publicly and on the record that she'd saved his life, and the people closest to them took that at face value, because they'd seen what he was like before her and what he was like after. What made the 9th of May so difficult to process wasn't that the worst had happened, it was that those closest to him had genuinely believed in the months leading up to it that the worst wasn't going to happen. They said later he'd been trying to stay sober, that there'd been real, observable change. That's what made that Tuesday morning feel not like the inevitable conclusion of a story everyone had always known was heading one direction, but like a rupture. Something that had seemed to be going somewhere good, and then without warning, wasn't. Lori was in Alaska when it happened, there to promote her own debut album. Keith had driven her to the airport himself and given her a card at the gate. She'd been gone less than a week. The weekend before his death, Keith was alone in the house, their home in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, just north of Nashville. And without Lori there, without the structure and the steadiness she represented, he drank. He spent those days drinking. By the time Lane Palmer arrived on the Tuesday morning for coffee and golf plans, Keith Whitley's body had already absorbed more alcohol than most people encounter in a week. The morning itself you already know. The call to his mother. The coffee. The plans that sounded like an ordinary Tuesday. Lane leaving at 8:30, telling Keith to be ready within the hour. The ambulance. The hospital. The medical examiner, Dr. Charles Harlan, recorded a blood alcohol concentration of 0.47. Cocaine metabolites and traces of a diazepam compound were also found during the autopsy. Dr. Harlan attributed the cause of death to the alcohol alone, a concentration so high, he said, that it had stopped Keith Whitley's heart. Lori Morgan and the Whitley family have never publicly disputed that finding. The day after Keith Whitley died, Music Row was lined with black ribbons. More than 500 people attended his funeral. Ricky Skaggs was there, his friend from the bluegrass years, the man who had first encouraged him toward Nashville, who had believed in the voice before Nashville did. The country music community that had been watching Keith Whitley's rise with something close to astonishment was now learning to think about him in the past tense. He was buried at Spring Hill Cemetery outside Nashville. His headstone carries 2 inscriptions. On one side, "Forever yours faithfully, that's Keith." On the other, "His being was my reason, that's Lori, who has reserved the plot beside him." He was 33 years old. He had released 2 studio albums in his lifetime. A duet he had recorded with Lori Morgan, "Till a Tear Becomes a Rose," was released after his death and won the Country Music Association Award for Vocal Event of the Year, a small, strange grace note to a career that ended too soon. In the months and years after his death, RCA released the recordings he left behind. "I Wonder Do You Think of Me" went to #1. "It Ain't Nothin' went to #1. "I'm Over You" went to #1. The voice that had earned 3 consecutive chart toppers while he was alive kept earning them after he was gone, climbing charts in a city that was still learning to exist without him, reaching listeners who would never know they were hearing a dead man for the first time. In 2022, more than 30 years after that Tuesday morning, the Country Music Hall of Fame inducted Keith Whitley posthumously. It was the institution's formal acknowledgement of what people who'd heard him already knew, that the voice coming out of Sandy Hook, Kentucky, had been one of the real ones, that it belonged in the permanent record. The man who waited 15 years to become a star spent less than 12 months at the top before an ordinary Tuesday morning ended it. What he left behind kept rising long after there was anyone left to watch it go up.